Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for Navigating Uncertain Times. I am Ginny Glassner, President of the Highland Park Chamber of Commerce. Thank you to all our partners today, First Bank of Highland Park, the Highland Park Community Foundation, Wipfli, and the Highland Park Chamber of Commerce. Before we begin, some brief information about today's webinar. First, all attendees are in mute mode to allow for focus on the presenters. Please submit your questions through the chat feature located at the bottom of your screen. The chat will be monitored and the questions shared with the panelists during the Q&A period. In a couple of days, we will email you a virtual takeaway packet from today's webinar, and the webinar is being recorded, so you'll be able to listen to it again or share the link. Well, it's a whole new world out there, one in which there are so many unknowns. You may feel, as I sometimes have, that we are experiencing a great pause. So how far out is your organization willing and able to plan into the future? Strategic planning may be even more important in uncertain and turbulent times. It can provide clarity and alignment for our direction. As nonprofits, we influence community, well-being, and economic prosperity. And if we're expected to do so, we need to be responsive to these realities and adjust our approaches to strategic planning, and in turn, from that, craft our working budgets. Our speakers this morning will address these issues. I am pleased to welcome Courtney Olson from First Bank of Highland Park and Brian Gaumont from Wipfli.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Courtney Olson with First Bank of Highland Park. First Bank has been around for 65 years, and we are one of the 5 largest privately held banks in Chicago. We have a full spectrum of both personal and business products to serve the community. I am heading up the business banking department, and with that focus is we specifically focus on smaller and mid-sized local companies, and we have a special niche in nonprofit. The bank is very focused on giving back to the community, and with that, we have developed an array of nonprofit products specifically to maneuver through the different complexities that a nonprofit has. So, and this is definitely a specialty and a passion of mine to help serve this nonprofit arena, and I'm happy to be here this morning. Brian, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, why don't I give that a shot. Good morning, everybody. I'm Brian Gaumont, principal here. I'm actually in our Madison, Wisconsin office. Don't hold it against me too much. I do get down to Chicago quite frequently. We have several offices in and around the Chicagoland area, but Wipfli is a CPA and consulting firm. We do, like Courtney shared, we have a niche within the nonprofit practice, and that's exclusively where I spend my time. My focus is in strategic advisory, so I do a lot of strategic planning with nonprofit organizations of various types. I would say I spend probably a particularly large amount of my time working with poverty fighting organizations, early childhood organizations, and kind of various human service organizations. Not to say we don't work with different organizations like, arts organizations and, programs such as that. But it's just been a passion for me for my career here at Wipfli. And this certainly has been a different way of looking at how organizations plan out their strategy and kind of maybe some of the conflicts that seem to arise between short-term and long-term strategy given, a pandemic such as this. So very excited to be here to share in a little bit of a discussion and then answer some questions along the way. So I'm going to hopefully do the one and only technical thing that I have to do, which is to share my screen. And of course, choosing the right one is part of that. So Courtney, you let me know if you're seeing my screen.
You are good to go, Brian.
I haven't yet screwed that up. That is wonderful.
Congratulations. That's why we gave you the job and not me.
Well, yeah, let's make sure I can get all the way through it here, but thank you. So I want to as we kind of start the discussion here, I do want to hit on 3 points. One being really managing unanticipated or sort of forced change, and what that means to both the organization and the people that work in our organization. Second would be, how do we work on some of those short-term strategies that align with our mission and don't, we're not sacrificing the good work that we are trying to do with our long-range goals, but knowing we have to create some shifts to be able to get through a crisis time such as this. And then third would just be, are there actually opportunities, and have we seen in the work that we do, nonprofits kind of innovate during this time of crisis, which seems like a strange thing to even suggest, but we'll talk a little bit about that. So the first piece being really managing change as a whole. And so, there is a sort of a thought process that goes around how change is managed overall, but it is a little bit different when we get forced into it, and it's something that we aren't prepared for. So even in organizations that quote unquote are change ready or have people that are change agents, when we are able to forecast some of the change ahead, such as if our nonprofit is adding a new program, or we're going to develop a new technology or implement a new technology, we're able to follow some of those best practices of change management, right? Get up in front and communicate clearly, what is the impact of that change? Why are we doing it? Following several mediums for communicating that change. We're working with our middle managers to make sure that they understand what it is that they have to communicate to any frontline staff. All of those things are sort of the best practices around change management, kind of the change management 101. And the thing is those still are really important. But what we have to acknowledge is that every individual goes through this life cycle of emotions and kind of change. And with a crisis like this can be something that they're experiencing on a daily basis, because they're not just experiencing change in the workplace, they're experiencing change at home, right, in their lives. And so what our job is as leaders of nonprofit organizations, and there might be a variety of individuals that are on this webinar that may say, well, am I a leader? I'm not the CEO. Really, all of us have leadership roles in one way or another. And what we can do here, and what we should strive to do, is not eliminate any of these emotions that are being experienced by our employees. But what we should try to do is shorten the time that they go through this life cycle of change. And the way that we do that is through some of those best practices around managing change. And the one or a couple that I would like to speak about is, first, the clear and honest communication with authenticity is absolutely paramount. We cannot say as employers that we know everything, because we don't, right? There is a degree of uncertainty that exists that we can't predict what comes next. All we can do is prepare for it using the information that we have, and clearly communicate what we know and what we don't yet know. And that authenticity and giving confidence in your employees that you're working with the information that you have, but have to be ready to adjust based on new information and anything that changes, the circumstances. That authenticity is going to be, and is, I'm sure as many of you experience, is really critical in creating some confidence and less worry in your employees, therefore, really compressing that life cycle of the human response to change. Our goal, of course, being, how can we create the most productive and effective employees that feel safe and secure and confident in their work. And for us to do that, we do try to bring them to the far upper right-hand quadrant, and we can get them there by, again, compressing that change, by being authentic leaders and clearly communicating what is going on. And then the second piece being that we create those feedback channels that aren't one way, right? It isn't top down. It isn't, here's what we're doing. We are indicating what we're doing, but we also want to hear what are those challenges that are being experienced, because in a time where we don't know all the answers, we need the experiences of employees to be shared with our leadership to indicate what it is that we should be doing. One of the other things of change is also, I would say when I was talking about 101 is really getting back to some of those basic principles that helped establish our organization and create the values that we have. And one of those values being from a financial standpoint, how do we work with a budget that really can be used in a time frame like this in a crisis time. And that I would like to maybe turn it over to Courtney to talk a little bit about kind of the budget perspective and how executive directors, boards, and the organization can work through some of those financial components.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Brian. I think Brian has a good idea here of putting up all of these emotions that come in when there is change. And the biggest thing, actually, Brian, can we go back to the previous one?
I screwed it up, Courtney.
No worries, no worries. I'm just not ready for that one yet. So what the good point here is when you're thinking of numbers, you have to, and budgeting, you have to try and take all of these emotions out of the number crunching. And get down to figuring out what Brian was saying. What do you know? What can you clearly communicate? And to me, that's going back to the basics with a budget. So there's three main points here is, understand your financial position in terms of both net assets and liquidity. You need to identify how this current circumstance is affecting both the revenues and the expenses. And then how do you manage your cash flow for all of that? So, again, back to the basics. What do you have? What do you have to work with? What cash is flexible without the restrictions? I know you guys all know about, restricted versus unrestricted cash. They sometimes call it a LUNA or liquid unrestricted net assets. What can you redeploy to help you now? How much does that unrestricted cash cover your operating expenses? How many months does that give you? Again, let's work with the board and see what can be redeployed if it is restricted. And then you should also take a hard look at what programs you are currently looking at and committed to, and over the time frame, whether it's a week, a month, a year, can you successfully meet the expectations of that project? And if not, you need to go back and talk to the donor that set that restriction to see if there is some flexibility there, or maybe the project you need to move on from that and focus somewhere else. So again, understanding where your cash and assets can benefit you today, within a week, within a month, within a year. We really want to start looking at budgeting short term because, as we know, things change quickly. We were, back in March, we were all in our offices, and within a week, we were all working from home. And things continue to change. When's the vaccine coming out? Who knows? So it's a combination of planning for the now and the next week and what cash do you have for that, but also looking forward to how long are we going to be sitting here in this current situation. We thought, hey, we've got to just flatten the curve in 14 days and we're good to go. We're back in our offices. Well, 9 months later, we're not. So it's that fine line of being able to pivot on a quick term, but also look at the long term. So knowing your cash basis right now is super important. Revenues, also very important to look at. And you all know nonprofits have two types of revenues, your contributions and then your earned by your programs. So with your contributions, can you turn to your current donors and ask them to either increase or expedite their donations at this point? A lot of you have heard me talk before, and anything that you're not using today, you need to be saving for tomorrow. So if you have additional revenue that you were able to expedite from from your donors. If obviously, put the Band-Aid on, kill the bleeding, tourniquet, but then make sure that you plan out, again, a week, a month, a year. Looking at fundraising. Can you do anything new with fundraising? And Brian will touch on this a little bit when he talks about innovating. Is there new stuff that we can do? And actually, I've talked to a lot of my nonprofits that I serve, and they've been able to actually increase because now they're virtual. Where they thought they were just this little local nonprofit, they've been able to reach out nationally and touch more individuals that really get their mission and have been able to generate some new fundraising. So again, we'll talk about how to be more innovative in a little bit. And then again, on the earned revenue for your programs, same type of concept. You thought you were this little organization that was in this box and could only have your members come, I don't know, 10 miles away. Now you offer virtual programming. Stretch that out. That's a new source of revenue for you. You also need to look at your expenses, the flip side. You guys know fixed versus semi-fixed versus variable. Where can you massage those? Obviously, your largest cost is payroll. Brian mentioned you've got these really important employees. Obviously, you don't want to, knee jerk and say, well, we'll just scrap. We got to do a payroll cut, so we just got to do layoffs. Where can you redeploy these individuals that maybe have the expertise with your mission, but maybe not quite the skill set of a virtual program? You can retrain them. And that way you can pair up your new revenue source with the payroll that you want to keep. Lastly was so now that you've kind of figured out where your cash is, how everything was affected as far as revenues and expenses, how do you manage that cash? Again, you want to be looking at that weekly, monthly, quarterly. You have to have a cash flow projection for that. Look at the revenues that were at risk and rank them. Come up with backup plans. The daily and non-essential payments, work with vendors. See if they can put you on some sort of a payment or deferment plan. Again, go to your donors. See if you can accelerate their payment. And this is where I would suggest actually using a banking tool called ACH origination, where when your cash is coming in. And you don't have to wait for that check, checks in the mail. Well, the post office is a little slow these days. So you want to try and use the tools that are at your fingertips to get the cash in the bank as quickly as possible, because you need that cash to both survive and thrive in the future. I've always said 3 months of reserves in your bank account should be enough. Well, again, look how long we've been sitting in a COVID environment. So maybe 3 months isn't long enough anymore. And every dollar that you can shave off in a program or on an expense, you should put it into a reserve. Brian, I was wondering if you had any additional ideas for strategic planning and maybe coming up with a couple different budgets and scenarios.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Courtney. So, we've definitely seen a struggle with the organizations that are able to do the financial analysis and understand kind of what's the baseline, but then struggling to say, well, what do we do next? Because of that degree of uncertainty that I was referring to prior, it seems overwhelming to even take a step into designing plans for a return to office or designing plans to move, programming to virtual. It seems like every step that we might take, we might be stepping in the wrong direction. And we even have organizations that say, do we take our long range strategy and throw it out the window? And we usually tell people, no, don't do that. But, you think of certain organizations that are focused around maybe growth of some of their services, be it, extending into other counties or, working with additional clientele. And the idea of growth during a pandemic is one that's quite challenging to think through. Whereas, the thought of, well, how do we focus on caring for, delivering services for the primary stakeholders, primary individuals that we've really been working with up to this point, is becoming kind of one of those, those focal points is, can we do enough through our current stakeholders and network that might build us additional opportunities here in the future? So all of that is to say is that it is possible to continue down the path of where you're moving your long range goals that are in alignment with your mission, but really taking the step, and Courtney hit on it, is like, this is a time where we need to have real time data and be able to make real time decisions, because things are still moving at a pace that is, very unpredictable. And traditionally, strategic planning has lent itself to, let's set something, let's put a couple plans together, we'll check this maybe on a quarterly basis and report on it maybe on an annual, definitely on an annual basis to the board.
Yeah, I always imagine, Brian, here's that strategic notebook and we take it off the shelf every quarter and dust it off.
Yeah, exactly. Can't do that. So we absolutely can't do that. And to the same idea of what Courtney was saying, that we have to go through these processes of frequent analysis. That's what the process of strategic planning really is now, is how do we look at likely scenarios, build plans around those, and create action plans that really lead us down the path. And what really, I would say, those high functioning organizations are doing is saying, what's the most likely scenario? And a scenario is, I use the analogy of, we're here in the Midwest. We know in this January it's going to be cold, it's going to snow, right? Those are two things that basically are guaranteed. What we might not know is that on January 15th it's going to be 15 degrees and snow 4 inches, right? We don't know that. But what we can do from a scenario planning standpoint is lend, kind of put our thought around, well, what can we plan for that is likely to happen? But then we can also put kind of those barriers or those guardrails of what's the worst case scenario and what's the best case scenario. And we build action plans around each of those. And look, there are curveballs that are going to happen that we cannot predict or build scenarios for. But I'd rather have an organization that's built scenarios around 75% of the things that are going to come our way, and address the 25 that are curveballs that come in, rather than, building a 25% plan and having to deal with 75% on the fly. So that's where this idea of looking at scenarios, building action plans around each of those, best case, worst case, most likely, is really a key strategy. And I'll just, put this slide out there real quick. It's the process that we use is one where, and this is kind of commonly used, I think, with several organizations, is let's break this down into really manageable chunks. Let's start with looking at, through the lens of the pandemic, what do we want to achieve this year? So we look at that, and then we break it down to, well, okay, if those are the things we want to achieve, what do we want to do? What do we need to do this quarter? And then how do we specifically do those things? So getting down into the details of who, by when, what's it going to look like? What are those specific tasks? And even more, I won't say more importantly, but as important, what is the budget implication for us to do that? So back to Courtney's point, we're building these, scenarios around our budget and how our finances are projecting out. Well, this is an indicator of what the budget may have to consider, right? Is there a $50,000 spend for us to move this programming into a virtual platform? Is there significant staff time investment for us to do that? So it's really taking those considerations and working through those detailed action steps, and then saying, okay, this is going to be $50,000. Can we afford to do that in our current state? Or, if we're going to do it, we have to work more on some additional fundraising tactics. So it really brings to light what are those things that are likely, that we believe will come to pass, that most likely scenario, what's the budget implications? But then, as importantly, how do we get there? So, so that's where I see, I think, a lot of organizations working through that process, is just to really define those key scenarios and work through it. And knowing that, again, you're going to make some mistakes, but you're able to you're able to cast that scenario around some of those things that are likely to happen. So, Courtney, I think what that maybe lends itself to is, how our organization can do things that they have to do in the short term, not sacrificing their mission, but ultimately trying to maximize their impact, right? And knowing finance is a huge piece of that. I wanted you to talk maybe a little bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a great model to use when you have to make these really difficult decisions that Brian was working through. Is, can we spend the money? Will it have an impact? So what it really is you're looking at a dual bottom line. How can I be financially successful, but how can I also have my mission be successful too? So, especially right now during a time of pandemic, we only have limited cash resources, as we were talking about before. How do we deploy that cash with the biggest bang for our buck? I really like this model because, again, it takes the emotion out of the finances. So you need to look at, okay, I could be really profitable with a project, and it's going to be high impact. So yes, I know I can go virtual with XYZ programming, and I can go outside of my geographic area. So guess what? I'm going to make more money when I go virtual with this program. So to me, that's a high mission impact, high profitability. You want to keep that on the table all day long when you're working in your budgeting. And this goes to the fact that you need to program budget. You need to project budget and get into those little nitty gritty details. Your next is, okay, I have a high impact, and maybe I'm not making as much money. So that's going to be something that you're going to want to, okay, we're going to keep it on the table, and we're going to have discussions. And maybe in a month, this is something that changes into a lower profitability, and we're not reaching as many people as we hope. So we're going to scrap that. So that could be something that these all can move quadrants, but that could be a very likely move in a very short-term time period. The two on the bottom quadrants, you're looking at something that doesn't have a lot of impact, but is high profitability. So that's really, boosting up your coffers, and you kind of need those sometimes to handle the operating expenses. So something to consider. What is truly important in this fourth, bottom left-hand quadrant is where you need to stop a program. And again, this model is helpful because it takes the emotion out of it. You might have a legacy program that your organization has been doing forever. However, when you put it on this model, you know what? We're only reaching about 3 people, and we're definitely losing money. This is the time to cut the fat, especially in times of crisis and what we're living in today. You can't be carrying a program or a project that is not benefiting your mission or your bottom line. So I really love this model because you can sit with your board and say, you know what? I know we've had the Susie Smith program forever and a day, but when you look at it on a logical basis, it is not helping or serving us both by mission and finances. And, here's an opportunity where maybe you can go out with another organization that has a very similar program and partner with them, because guess what? They have the resources to continue on with this program, but you don't, and you can see where it's not benefiting you. So can you collaborate with other nonprofit organizations for this specific program and really, you know, your ideas are aligned, and now you've got the extra assistance that you may be needing. So as Brian was saying, you want to try and do this on a scenario-based budgeting. You're not going to have all of the information when you're looking at this model. And you don't, while you need real-time information, you don't want to get stuck in that analysis paralysis and you're freezing and you're not making a decision and moving forward because you only have partial information. Right now, it's all about being flexible, being nimble, and pivoting. So again, if you decide, hey, we're going to keep this, you know, it happens to have a high mission impact, but low profitability, we're going to keep that for a little bit. And you look at it again, not every quarter. Don't take that thing out and dust it off every quarter. Let's look at it. How are we doing this week? How did it do this month? Okay, how did it do this month? Now we need to cut it because it's just not serving us anymore. So again, you know, don't get stuck because you were only able to kind of loosely figure out a budget and you couldn't come up with exact numbers. You want to be able to make a decision and communicate clearly why you did. And I think this model is very helpful for that. You know, something I want to remind all of us nonprofits is you probably started off at a kitchen table and you grew into these large organizations. You need to go back to thinking like that kitchen table mindset and kind of starting over and going, okay, what's really good for us and what do we have the cash to do at this time? Brian, anything you want to add there?
Yeah, I think one of the things we've learned and the reality that we're in is that doing nothing really is not an option. Like for once in our organization's, you know, longevity, our lives, doing nothing isn't an option, or, you know, it is, but it likely means, you know, that you won't be solvent here in the near future, or it will significantly impact your finances and your mission. So, you know, if you want to look at any way that there could be a silver lining, is that sometimes you can innovate through being forced into it. Now, not the way I would choose to have it, right? I would rather choose how and when the processes happen. But this pandemic is forcing organizations to rethink how they deliver on their mission. And it is creating some, you know, innovations along the way. And, you know, sometimes that word is, oh, it's this, you know, brand new thing that's, you know, bringing in, you know, $2 million a year for a nonprofit. That's not the reality, right? For a lot of organizations. Innovation can just be, it is working on things that are high mission impact and high profitability, as Courtney just described, and doing those things perhaps in a way that we hadn't thought of before, or through a medium that we hadn't used before, right? Because we have to do it differently. So, you know, bringing all of those factors together, where we thought of, you know, the human response to change and those internal and external factors to our organization, knowing that absolutely in the center of it, we're focused on the stakeholders, the clients, right? Those really drive our ultimate decision. And even in our financial decisions, as Courtney was saying, you know, if we're looking at a program that serves very few individuals, and, you know, it usually is something that also isn't monetarily beneficial for our organization. So we have to make those decisions of what programming, what offerings do we have that create the best benefit for our clients and for our organization. And so some examples of what we've seen from you know, an innovation standpoint, when, you know, we work with some of the organizations on the human services side, you know, something I'm sure many of us are familiar with is kind of now the mainstreaming of telehealth, right? That was something that kind of sat in the fringes and, you know, was talked about and, you know, was maybe going to be something in the future. But now you think about the impact that the pandemic has had on, you know, behavioral and mental health, and how we can actually receive the care that's needed. This has become a mainstream path for receiving care, and it's not going away, right? This is going to be something that, as we move through and out of this crisis, and we will, that this will be a piece that stays, you know, with our organizations, with some that deliver that type of service. for numbers of years to come, indefinitely. Similarly, what we're striving for here as organizations is not to just make some of those short-term decisions that will have to be reverted after the pandemic, but instead say, what can we do that might actually have some staying power, or hopefully does have some, extended staying power, that will allow us to offer our services in a different way. And that's the innovation, right? High impact on your mission, high profitability, and something that has that longevity that can outlast the pandemic. And those things can feel like they're challenging to come by, but as you move through that process of planning and really identifying, what do we need to stop doing? What are the things that really are our core services and how they align with our mission? Then the thinking that is involved on how do we take that core service offering and move it to a way that it meets the needs of our current constituents, but just in a different way. That's where that innovation happens. And so, I would just go on to say that it is an unfortunate way to have to find our way into innovation, because we didn't bring it upon ourselves. We didn't plan for it. And instead we just have to do it. But many times it can feel like status quo is an okay option. And I don't mean that in any sort of negative way, right? Because the work we do is great, but change is necessary. Now we have an opportunity to bring change that might have taken us 5, 10, 15 years and do it in 6 months. And it's scary, but it's also a huge opportunity for us to innovate and create that degree of change that we just have to do now, rather than planning out over, a multitude of years. So
yeah, Brian, I mean, it's amazing how all our organizations and all these nonprofit organizations went from, heck no, we can't work remotely, to deploying how many laptops and how many different devices, and being able to be resilient in this time. And I think everybody needs to start getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. And it's that uncomfortableness that's going to push everybody to where they need to be.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Yeah. All right, Mike, I think I'm going to toss it back to you to start the Q&A portion.
Great, thanks, Brian. If anyone has any questions or comments, they're welcome to post them into the chat and we'll address them for you. Susan, just to verify, yes, the webinar will be sent out after we finish later today, as well as the slides.
And we'll put up a slide with all of our contact information as well.
Yeah. Do you want?
Yes, and everyone will receive a
that up,
follow-up email with the link to the recording and with the takeaway packet from today.
No questions have come in so far, so I guess you guys covered everything thoroughly.
Maybe I would just comment. One of the questions we often get is, how do we actually work through all of this stuff, right? We kind of talked about it, I think, both in theory and in practice, but like, how do we actually work through this? And it is a opportunity for your leaders, meaning kind of hierarchical, CEO and your kind of leadership team, but it's also that opportunity and a necessity to bring in those people that are really working more, program facing, client facing, because they're working with it every day and coming up with these, scenarios and working through the action plans and thinking through the potential budget impact of those scenarios. That really is, that is a best practice in general for strategic planning, but it is very, very critical now. Engaging the people that do the work in the process of planning for what's going to change is huge, because there's a couple benefits, but one is, if there's going to be a change, they're involved in designing what the change is rather than being told this is what you now have to do. They're involved in designing the scenario and the planning around what they're going to do. So that's a best practice that I would just, suggest out there is if you're going through these planning processes and feel like, you can manage it within your organization, make sure that you're engaging a multitude of stakeholders that really do the work so that you're shortening that change curve and that human response to change.
Yeah, I'd also add, and this would be maybe sounding odd to some when you're in a cash crunch and in this time, is add useful tools. So there are budgeting scenario tools out there, some that are very simple and cheap, and then some that are very sophisticated. But right now would be a good time to invest in something like that in order to give you that ease of looking at the numbers.
Got a few questions in now.
Oh, good.
Robbie asks, how are banks adapting their loaning policies in this uncertain period? And then what new strategies has First Bank specifically accelerated?
Yeah, great question. So, something to remember as an organization when thinking about loans is it's a loan. It's something you have to pay back. Where you've got the program like the Paycheck Protection Program, that reminder, that is a loan, everyone, that just has forgivable conditions to it. But as an organization and as a board, is this a good time to be borrowing? How are you going to pay those funds back? And that's exactly what the banks are looking at, going, okay, what do you need the funds for? And how are you going to pay the loan back? We're obviously being very protective. I'm very protective of my clients when they approach me for a loan, saying, okay, what's the specific reason? And can you get out from under this debt? Because debt is not a long-term solution to what right now is a short-term problem, or we hope it is. So that's really what banks are looking at. I wouldn't say that we're necessarily changing our policies. We're just being very careful, and we're asking these very difficult questions to the organization, saying, okay, and how are you going to make us full? And how, Michael, what was the second question? How First Bank is what?
What are some new strategies that First Bank in particular has accelerated?
Well, at the bank, I know we went from having, 50 laptops deployed to something like 150. So we, like you, organizations, have figured out how to successfully do business in this very different time. So that's just one example of what we're doing.
And then Nancy asks, what are some strategy suggestions for getting people comfortable with all of the change that's being implemented?
Brian, I'll let you handle the change piece.
Sure. Yeah. So a couple of the best practices that we would use. Well, maybe I'll point to a specific source that Wipfli uses. It's an organization called ProSci, PROSCI, and they Google them. They have some free resources out there. And they're really like internationally known as thought leaders around change management. And that's a methodology that's kind of tried and true that we subscribe to. And their model is, it's called ADKAR is the acronym. And so it's, let's see if I can get this: awareness, desire, knowledge, ability, and reinforcement. And so there are strategies within each of those of how you work through really any change, including a unanticipated or rapid change. One of the big ones that I always kind of point to that really does get skipped, because a lot of times, like, if there's a new program that we're going to offer, or, we've switched to a new CRM system, people move right from, we're going to design the system, we're going to train you, and then we're off and running. But you forget the desire part, which is really the kind of the what's in it for them, right? How do we describe the benefit of this change, for them in their position, what the necessity is, what's going to happen if we don't make that change. Not like saying, if you don't do this, you're fired, but organizationally, what happens if we don't address this or shift, to this new program or software or what have you. So that is core to even our current circumstances, making them understand, how a change is going to be significant to them in their role, and how it is going to allow them to, do their work in a different way, but, thinking long-term, this is going to benefit us because of X, Y, Z. So those would be, that's one in particular that I like to focus on. And I think I mentioned in the presentation, I mean, that, as leaders, authentic and clear communication and two-way communication channels, those are kind of just foundational, but sometimes in our rapid planning for all of these shifts, it can get missed. And so, just making sure that we're remembering that our role as a leader is to be that transparent, thoughtful and caring leader, and making sure that we're open to information that are the experiences of our staff.
Next question is, what are your thoughts on adjusting the budgets for boards? How often, if at all?
So a budget it's a budget, it's a goal, it's something to attain to. So right now, I think most people are used to, okay, you make an annual budget and you review it with your board on a quarterly basis. I think more so now than ever, what we have to adapt to is not these annual budgets, but something more of a living, breathing budget. Something that's constantly moving, and just explaining to the board, okay, here's what we set out to do this month, and we didn't achieve it. So if you meet with your board on a quarterly basis, yeah, I would absolutely be making some changes or earmarking things, asterisks. But on a monthly basis, if you don't meet with them, I would at least communicate with your board, and like Brian was saying, your stakeholders, your employees. The more transparent you are with your employees in this time of uncertainty, the more they're going to rally behind you. So if there is someone specifically tied to a project, you don't want to go 3 months later and say, hey, you didn't make any money in this project, we got to let you go. If they had seen the numbers throughout those 3 months, maybe they could have made a change and it could have been more effective. So I would say both with the board and your staff to have some sort of living, breathing budget that you're constantly working through.
And Nancy asks, are there any new financial tools out there that can be of assistance to nonprofits?
I'm trying to think. Brian, do you know any offhand?
Financial tools, not that
we can always do some research and get back to you with some good suggestions. But what I, as a banker, what I would always suggest and always have suggested is make sure that you have the tools that are readily available to you right there at the bank. Make sure you're using bill pay. I mentioned ACH before, to control your cash flow. So that would be something that I would suggest that's already available to you. Writing checks, there's been a ton of fraud going on, both last year and now into the pandemic. So check writing, I would advise against, and using bill pay and positive pay would be something that I would suggest to protect your funds.
And thanks to my colleague on this one who's sitting as part of this webinar. One of the beauties of being able to have Microsoft Teams in the background, National Council of Nonprofits, and then Forefront Illinois State Association. My colleague was saying have some tools out there that could be helpful in kind of budget scenarios and financial planning.
Thanks, George.
And then lastly, we had a question come in that says, hi, any good ideas for fundraisers during this time? To put you on the
what
spot
I've heard
there.
is SAS is not necessarily a fundraiser, but really having you, your board, your staff reach out personally to donors, that's having a bigger impact right now, and telling the story than, you know, some sort of virtual fundraiser. I've heard a lot of nonprofits have success with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one other piece to, you know, it's I think a lot of organizations are trying to find that thing that kind of keeps them relevant, you know, and you know, the needs of individuals are kind of shifting, you know, they are changing dramatically during the pandemic time. So it might be kind of a look again at like who are we serving, and not just like, you know, how should we deliver differently to them, but like, have their needs changed? And that might apply more so for some organizations than others. But, you know, we've seen, you know, boys and girls clubs who, you know, they're an after school, you know, program, and some offer, you know, daycare services. Well, those weren't being offered, and still aren't in some areas. So what is it that they need to do to meet the needs of children and families? And so it's, you know, providing, you know, meals. It shifted what they had to do. It didn't change their mission, but how they're doing it. And they were able to say, well, you know, during this time, you know, we need to shift because the need is around these things. We can't be providing after school care. And that really helped create a new campaign and communication to the community that a lot of individuals were interested in, because it was addressing something that was, you know, kind of urgent, needed, and really relevant to the local community.
That's all the questions that have come in. So Jenny, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Michael. First of all, I want to thank everyone for attending today's webinar, and to let you know that if you think of any other questions, on your screen is the contact information for all of the panelists and organizations that are coordinating this program today. You will also get this information in your follow-up email packet. And on behalf of the Highland Park Chamber, I want to thank you so much. And now I am very pleased to welcome David Reich, Chair of the Board of the Highland Park Community Foundation, who will give our closing remarks. David?
Thanks, Jenny. Just wanted to thank everybody, Wipfli and First Bank of Highland Park, Brian and Courtney, and you, Jenny, from the Chamber. I think that was really helpful. It, you know, we're all sort of in crisis mode here, and you know, looking at these things strategically and trying to reprioritize what we're doing is great. So appreciate that. That's, you know, this is part of the mission of the Highland Park Community Foundation, is, you know, not only to raise and distribute money, but to, you know, educate and bring people together. Hopefully we can do this in person in the future, but this was great. And thank you. If anybody has any questions for any of us, you have the contact information. And if you have any questions about the Highland Park Community Foundation, you can contact me or Terry, and you know, we'd be happy to discuss what we're doing and the emergency grants that we've been making. So thanks very much for attending. I think this was great.
Thank you all. Have a great rest of your day.